If you're struggling with making your recorded drums sound good, or not sure where to start or how to treat them, or just looking for some inspiration on how to make your real recorded drums sound as best as they can, today I'm going to walk you through everything to do with the drums in my latest cover, which is a rock version of There's Nothing Holding Me Back by Shawn Mendes. These were home recorded drums with gear and mics in a room that basically anybody would have access to. I'm going to break down how I mixed them, some of the plugins that I used, and take a look at how they were actually recorded. And spoiler, there's nothing super special about these drums that you can't do yourself. Yet they turn out amazing in the mix, so I'm gonna break down how I did that today. What is up, guys? Alex from ANAK Creates here. I'm an audio engineer, mixer, and producer, and I've been working for over a decade in the professional music industry. I'm here to help you make music you can be proud of. So before we dive into Pro Tools and actually take a look at how I mixed the drums, first, here's Malcolm Cottle, who drummed on the song as well as recorded the drums himself, talking about the mics that he used and a bit about the recording setup that he has.
My main, if you will, my main production room is the room I'm in right now, which is just a spare room in my house where I have my iMac and all my good stuff. And then all of my drums and everything are down in the basement. Right now, basically what I have is my drums are in a corner and then sort of surrounded by almost like a band shell of just black king-size bed sheet to kind of insulate the sound a little bit. And then my recording rig is down there and I just record all the drums onto a laptop. So my rig currently includes a Focusrite liquid Saffire 56. It includes two ADAT ins. So I get 8 preamps off the liquid Saffire, and then I can run in 16 more individual preamps, so I can get a total of 32. I ran a Focusrite Octo Pre Dynamic into the liquid Saffire, and I have that just on a little swivel desk. The DAW I use is Logic Pro X.
Do you have fancy mics? Do you have a whole bunch of mics?
SM57 on the top and the bottom of the snare. On my kick, I have the CAD kit mic as my out mic, kick mic kind of right in the porthole, and then on the inside, right close to the beater head, I use the tom mic from the CAD set. All it does is pick up the click. On the toms, I had Seinheiser E604s on the rack and the floor. Overheads, I was still using the CAD overheads. They're just small pencil cardioid mics, but they have a roll-off and a pad on them. And they're nice and bright. They just pick up cymbals really well. On the hi-hat, I have an Art M6 pencil microphone. Again, it's got a roll-off and a pad. The room mic, I used a SM57, and I kind of pointed it slightly upwards just because I wanted to capture more cymbals. I knew you were going to be probably sample replacing, so I knew you were going to have good quality samples, so I wasn't as worried about capturing the tone of the drums, more just the transients, and I was really more concerned with just getting a really nice cymbal sound for you that would sound big and natural.
So now, jumping into the Pro Tools session itself, we're looking at the drums. Now, the drums are all in folder tracks in Pro Tools, so I actually have one big folder track, which is a routing folder track with all the drums that are going to it, and then I have the kick, the snare, the tom tracks, and the kit, which is the hi-hats and overheads, and then the room track, there's only one room track, so it's not in a folder of its own, and then there's a bunch of aux tracks, which we'll get to, all kind of going back to the main drum folder track. So that's how I have it routed. First, I'm just going to play the beginning of the track so you can hear the drums in context, then just the drums themselves. So let's just start from the top and how I arrange the drums, and frankly how I think about the drums kind of when I mix them as well. So first, starting from the top, I just have the trigger tracks right here, which are inactive, and I don't really need them once I've put in the samples. They're literally just the beginning of the little hits on the different drums, on the kick, snare, and toms, so that I can easily use a sound replacer or a Massey DRT to lay in samples and have them velocity accurate and laid in as audio so that I'm not trying to screw around with trigger or something that's doing it live on the fly. I've never really liked those. I actually like laying them in as audio. So the trigger tracks just allow me to do that really, really easily. I will cover this technique in a different video, so let me know in the comments below if you are interested in that. So first of all, in the actual kick drum folder, I have the kick in mic and the kick out mic. The kick in mic I was actually using, and the kick out mic I actually have muted and inactive. Then I have the samples that I have laid in. Now, I like sample augmenting. I don't actually use sample replacing most of the time. Sometimes on kick, but very rarely on snare and toms. But what I do is I actually lay in more samples than I need, each one with a different purpose, each one with something that I think might benefit or might actually work in the song. But I lay them all in so that in the actual moment of creativity, I can play around. I don't have to actually technically try and lay them in after the fact. So I actually pre-think of this. For the kick, for instance, I have samples that are more the low-end side of things. I have samples that are more the ticky attack side of things, and I use those to augment the real kick drum and just build the kick drum sound that I want. I do the exact same thing when it comes to snare and toms. I lay in more samples than I need, and then I just pick and choose depending on the part of the song and depending on the overall sound. So sometimes I will use these samples in some parts of the song and not in others, depending on what I'm trying to get out of the drum for that section of the song. For this, I actually only used 3 out of the 6 samples that I laid in, but I leave them in the session in case I'm looking for them a bit later. So the kick drum in its entirety sounds like this, which is a little bit different from the original kick with some EQ on it, but the original kick sounds like this. And then once I've added all the samples in, it's much bigger and much more consistent in the low end and in the attack. I do add a bit of SSL EQ on there. I do roll off some of the low end actually on the kick drum, especially the natural kick, but I am into adding some attack and taking away a bunch of the mids because that stuff is just mud in terms of the kick drum. I have a little bit of compression going on, nothing super crazy. So as you can see on the kick drum bus overall, I actually am adding even more top end at about 8K, a bit more at like 3.5K, and I'm adding even more at kind of 55 hertz and some more compression. Again, one thing that I like to kind of tell people is to not be shy with your EQ. You can crank these things. I'm adding 7 or 8 dB of top end, and then I'm adding about 3 dB more of bottom end, and I added 9 dB of bottom end on the original kick itself. So don't be shy adding compression and adding EQ. Just do it in a smart way and make sure that it's not making it sound weird. But if you have to crank it, you have to crank it. So just basically don't be shy about really giving her if you have to. So that's what the kick drum's doing. I'm a big fan of SSL channel strips, so you'll see this SSL plugin a lot in my mixes. I did kind of grow up on an SSL, so to speak, so I've used it for many, many years, real SSL channels, so I'm just really, really used to using them. That's how I think and I work my fastest, so I do use them quite a bit in my mixes. So next, on these snares, again, I am doing some different processing. I have an SSL EQ on here, and then I had actually just purchased these, so I was playing with these, the DF EQ from Drumforge, the DF Excite from Drumforge, which is just adding some top end and some bottom end, and then a deverb. I just needed a little bit of snare verb. I just quickly added it and ended up really, really liking it. It's just a non-linear reverb. It's called large, but it's only 350 milliseconds, just to give a bit more space to the snare. Because it was a basement recording, there wasn't a big room on the whole thing, and snare sounds really good when you put a reverb on it. So for the original snare, I did use both the original top and bottom snare. And to keep the realness of it, there is quite a bit of bottom, actually, especially when I EQ'd it and got the top end going. You can really hear the actual snares. Then to get the kind of attack and everything, again, here are the 4 samples that I used, and they each have their own different purpose in my mix. You'll see they're all mixed differently. There's kind of, some of them are low end, some of them are attack, some of them have a bit more room added on them, actually. So altogether, the snare sounds like this. Now, something to note with this is that I do have 4 samples through most of the song. However, in the verse, and when Malcolm is doing this marching band snare that sounds like this, I actually just boosted the original snares, and there are actually no samples in that section until the final build-up out of that section, because I couldn't make the samples sound accurate and natural compared to what he was doing. So instead of trying to make them work, I just cut them out and then just really made the real snare pop out in that section, which means that through the rest of the song, the snare samples aren't super, super loud, because I wanted to make sure that in that section, it didn't sound like it was a completely different drum set. It was naturally what the snares would have sounded like. So you can hear the transition here. There's no samples, and then samples on that end part. In the actual song, you don't really hear that. If you look at the automation, right as that ramp up is happening, the volume of the whole thing goes down a little bit, which is why the ramp up happens and the power of the snare gets a little bit more, but the overall sound of it and level of it doesn't change completely when I add 4 samples back in. So then moving on to the tom tracks. For the toms, I have a bit of processing. Again, another SSL console on here, adding a bit of top, adding a bit of attack. I took away some of the bottom end. I don't need them to be super, super big. There's a bit more compression on this, a 5:1, just to really make them pop. Malcolm really likes the toms to overly pop, and frankly, so do I. So there's a bit of compression on there, but mostly what I'm adding out of this is the attack. I just wanted that to really poke through. And then I have DF Excite. Again, I was playing with it, so I did add some low end from here and not in the SSL, but just a little bit. And then I compressed them again, more compression, because that's what makes the whole thing pop out just ever so slightly. And then I have one of my favorite plugins, which is the Pro Q3, and I wanted a little bit more bottom end again out of this, a nice 100 hertz boost, but I'm filtering off the really bottom end because I don't want the mud. I just want the thump of the toms. And then I took out 500. That's tends to be where everything gets muddy, so I took that out here, and I added a bit of top end, quite a bit of top end for when the actual attack happens. It is a dynamic EQ, so it actually will expand a little bit when the attack is hit. And then the really, really top end, just because I had the samples that I had a bit of an airy attack, and that made it sound unnatural when they were hit. So I just took that, just shaved that off a little bit because I didn't need the toms to be the top end. That was where the cymbals were. These are kind of fitting in the high mids of the overall drum mix. So there are tom samples in this, but this is what the toms sound like through one of their fills. Now, one other thing that I do with the toms is I actually cut out all of the audio around the toms, so only the toms themselves are actually there. I cut out all the bleed through the rest of the track because I don't want it, and I don't have to deal with gates, false opening, and adding little bits of weirdness in there. I literally go through and manually make sure that it's all chopped out except for the actual tom hits, and they all have a nice fade that I'm happy with, and I know exactly where they're going to go. I always find gates tend to not close fast enough or open randomly or weird things like that. So if I do this naturally myself, then I can control the exact attack, the exact fade manually, and then I just consolidate it so I have one big track of toms. So next we'll move on to the kit itself. So the kit bus for me is the cymbals, so the overheads and the hi-hat. If there are cymbal spot mics, I'll also kind of group that into the kit. I do have a bit of processing going on. Again, another SSL. I chop off a lot of bottom end. The overheads and the kit bus, I do like to take this and make a nice picture of the drums when possible, but when I'm using home recorded drums, a lot of the time I can't quite get a really nice picture because the room that it's in is a really big influence in that. So I don't have that luxury of having a beautiful room. I won't filter off nearly as much stuff when I'm in a really nice drum room, but sometimes I do have to make some compromises. The kit bus in this sense isn't about the overall picture of the drums, it's more about the cymbals. I want the cymbals to come out of this, also using that to blend it with the toms and the snare so that it's not like totally separated, because sometimes people roll off too much bottom end and then you end up getting this disconnected thing where the cymbals are really bright and beautiful in the top, but then it sounds disconnected and weird because you've actually filtered out the snare and the kick, which means that there's no connection. You've got this weird thin sounding snare in this because you can't get rid of the bleed, so you might as well embrace it just a little bit. But I didn't need a lot of boominess from it, so I took off a bunch of the bottom end, and then I leaned into the top end. I wanted the top end to brighten it up, and then again, of course, a little bit of compression just to kind of even out the cymbal hits a little bit more. Then I also used the new Fresh Air plugin from Slate, which I absolutely love. So I just used this to add a bit of top end air, because again, the cymbals can really help fill out that airy top end of the whole track in general. The track brightens up even when they're lower in the mix. They can still really hold that airy top end. There's not a lot competing there sometimes. So that's what I'm doing there. And then on the actual overheads themselves, I have a trim plugin, which is literally just to flip the phase. Then I also used the Slate virtual mix rack to add a bit of top end with the Neve EQ. I absolutely love the Neve EQ in this thing. And then I also used the FG2A, which is an LA2A, to just even them out a little bit. I wanted the cymbals not to move around a lot. Malcolm's a really good player, so he does hit very consistently, which is great, but I just like to even them out ever so slightly because, again, this is holding the air on top of the track. So the overall kit bus sounds like this. Now note how small the toms sound in this because we took out most of the bottom end. And then last but not least, we have the room mic. There's only one room mic, and as Malcolm said, it is a 57, and he pointed it upwards, again, to give me more cymbals. So the room does have some compression on it. I'm using a Wolf compressor, which is one of my favorite compressors. It's actually darkening it. It has a lot of lo-fi, and then I'm using the virtual mix rack to give me a bit of leveling with the FG2A, a bit of compression punchiness to it. I'm using this, just fattens it out. And then I also put this air plugin on here, but I'm actually just using the high cut to get rid of the top end. Ironically, because of the fact that it was too bright, so I actually took off some of the top end and get the warmth of the cymbals. So this is what the room mic sounds like with all of its stuff on it. Now, if I take off all of its processing, it sounds like this. Then next we have a drum room track right here, which I actually created, which is Valhalla Supermassive. I'm just sending from the overall kick bus, the snare bus, the toms, and the kit. So I'm just actually creating a fake room with all the samples and everything in it. So I just wanted to add a bit more width and depth with a fake room that I could also mix what parts were getting to the room more than others, so there's a bit less of the actual overhead kit and more of the toms, kick, and snare. Here's just the kick, snare, and toms going. And then here I'm adding the room. So you can hear the room kind of come in. So once again, here it is with the room, and then I'll take the room away. You can hear it tighten right up when I take that room out. So that's what that room is doing, adding a bit of width and just adding a bit more depth to it than the actual room mic was providing me. Then below the room mic, I have a kick and snare back bus, which is just some compression. It's actually this virtual bus compressor rack from Slate. The point of it is to add punch and top end to the kick and snare. So the kick and snare are both sending to it. They both have a send, and that's literally the only thing sending to it. And then below that, I have the full drum bus and a drum back bus, so that everything that's going in the drums has a back bus itself. Now, this one has the BX Townhouse bus compressor. I really liked it as just an overall addition to glue the whole drum kit together. The back bus compression, which some people also call rear bus compression, is just trying to add a bit more glue to the overall drums and fill in the spaces a little bit. And for me, I add a lot of warmth and attack with it as well. Less about the mids, less about the overall tone of it, and more about the actual attack. When I run everything through it, you'll see that the compression is actually quite high itself. It's almost 8 dB on this. It's not something that's super audible. It's just a slight thing that's there, adding a little bit of extra punch to it. And then I also roll off some of the top end. I don't need this to have a lot of attack. And I also am trying to contain the cymbals, because once you compress them with a back bus, especially with 8 dB, the cymbals start to get a little bit out of hand. So then I roll off the cymbals to make sure that this back bus isn't contributing to too much harsh top end that I don't really want. So that's kind of the overview of my use of the kick and snare back bus and the drum back bus. But leave a comment down below if you're curious about that, as I will be making a video looking a bit more about how I set up the back buses and my actual approach while mixing with them. So then all of these things get added into the overall drum bus, which then has a Noveltech character plugin on it, which is just something that I had tried for this, which is just adding actually a bit of brightness to it. And then I have the Pro Q3, which is again adding a bit more of that air top end to the whole thing, just to stick out in the mix ever so slightly. These two plugins on the main bus were more more of a last minute addition as I was mixing it. I had gotten the drums to somewhere that I really liked, but once they were in the mix and once I was crafting all of the guitar sounds and everything else, I just needed them to poke out a little bit more, and it wasn't volume and it wasn't any individual thing. It was just kind of overall a little bit brighter. So that's what these two plugins are doing. So that is kind of my approach to mixing the drums and what I use on the drums. This was my approach for this song. It changes all the time. I have no set method of doing it or set plugins that I use on every single one except for the SSL console plugin, because that's just how I think. So that concludes how I mix the drums on this song and how I kind of approach mixing drums, especially for home recorded drums, and kind of some of my thoughts behind how I mix them because they were home recorded and some of the compromises that I had to make. If you found this helpful, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss any future videos, and of course, leave a comment down below if you have any more questions about anything specific or something else you'd like me to dive into in a future video. And of course, go check out the full production video and how I approach the arrangement and the production of every other element in this song. Thank you guys for watching. That is it for this video, guys. I will see you in the next one. Until then, always be creative.